Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I painted this Yorkshire Terrier in acrylics. Now as always, once I've got the background painted, when I begin with the subject I always start with the eye. Now my first stage here is I like to simplify the process as much as possible, and I'll use titanium white to block in any bright highlights, and then I switch to Mars Black to start putting in the darkest areas of the eye. Now what this enables me to do is just initially focus purely on the size and shape of the eye. I want to make sure that I've got this accurate before I move on to any other stages. Now if the eyes are not the right size or shape, it's going to dramatically change the expression. So this is why I always like to start here first. Now as you can see here, I've painted a very dark colour for the rest of the iris. Now this was only because the reference photo, the eye colour was dark, so I was able to get away with working with quite a bold base layer. As I start to build in some of my midtones, you can see that I'm applying the paint with one brush and then I'm blending and softening with another. This enables me to capture a really nice shaping and that shading to the eye that I've mentioned previously. Now the shading is crucial. Any shadows that are being created from the fur at the top of the eyelid, that's going to create a darker shadow at the very top edge of that eye. Now if that shading's not there, it can make the eye look more two-dimensional and flat. So any areas where the highlights start to get a little darker, where you might have more of that indication of shadows, it's really important to capture that. Now at the moment, the highlights, they look really bold and too bright. The edges are far too light overall. But as I start to refine my top layers, I'm going to soften that. But making sure that I've got some key areas mapped in first, and in this case making sure those highlights are in the right place, it just helps to then follow that reference photo more accurately. Now as I start to build more of those finer highlights in the eye, you can see that more of that shaping, the realism and the depth is established. But I haven't jumped into the brightest highlights first. This is something that I'm going to focus on as we start working on the fur as well. The layering process is crucial when aiming for realism, and as much of that depth at these mid stages, it really does help to capture softness and subtlety. Now this softness and the blending is something that's now going to be a key feature as I start on the fur. I have now switched over to some filbert brushes so that I can get a little bit more of a larger application. However, despite this being a 10 by 12 inch canvas, it's a really nice size for this painting. You can see that the sizes of my brushes are still relatively small. Now the reason I prefer to go with this approach is it means that I'm less likely to map in too much of that colour. I'm more likely then to be able to follow even the fur directional changes at this base layer stage. Now as I continue with this base foundation, a real important aspect that I like to capture in any of my paintings, regardless of the fur colour or texture, is that this stage is blended and has a good degree of softness. Now as I'm building my values, as like with the eyes, I haven't jumped into my brightest highlights first. I want to work with more of a darker layer initially. Now what this is going to enable me to do is build up the depth in the fur in stages. But before we consider all of that later, it's this softness that's more important. Making sure that my base foundation is dark enough with the right degree of softness, I feel makes painting the details later on much easier. Now the real-time version of this tutorial, it really focuses on what layer of fur we should be focusing on at that right stage. Now this is a key part when drawing any fur, but especially fur that is overlapped like this. Longer fur has more freedom to move, and the way that it does overlap different clumps of that fur can make it more confusing and challenging to get right. So this is something that, as I say, I do focus more thoroughly in that real-time version of this tutorial. If that's of interest, I'll link the information to that in the description below. Now those lessons are recorded with a voiceover while I'm painting, so I'm able to explain everything in the moment and why I make those decisions on altering the brush technique and that layering process. But you can see as this layer is becoming more established that the softness is being reinforced with each layer that I'm adding. Now my base foundation, it never consists of one layer. You can see that I keep going over this to again capture that blended effect. So my base foundation, it might consist of 5 or 6 layers. This of course is going to depend on that fur texture, but as long as I've captured the softness, I will keep on layering if I feel I need to correct that even more. If I've got any harsh or sharper edges, I will just work more with my base foundation before I consider the next stage and get some of that texture mapped in. Now when I start to build in a little bit more of the texture, you can now see that I've switched over to a rigger brush. Now this rigger brush, a much longer bristle, is enabling me to create a finer but longer line. One of the advantages of this brush is that we don't have to keep reloading with paint. If you get the consistency of the paint right, you can create up to 10, 12 brush strokes depending on the length of that line you're trying to replicate. Now the consistency of that paint is really important. If you're using a rigger or a liner brush and you're getting start and stop points between that line, then that tells you that your mixture is likely too thick. It needs to have a little bit more water. If, however, you're creating a brushstroke and it's a little bit too beaded up, it almost looks like it's more transparent and it flows too quickly off that brush, then that mixture is too thin. You need to add more paint to get that consistency a little bit thicker. Now, once the balance of that paint mixture is correct, this brush is wonderful to use. Now, I'm not trying to create fine details with this brush, which is typically how I would use it. But for this, I just wanted the next layer of texture, but still creating some softness. So when I create that brush stroke, I then come back in sometimes with a blending brush and then soften that out even more. Now the key part of this technique now is that I don't want to then over blend. I'm still wanting to create some definition, but I'm making sure here that I'm not completely covering the layers underneath. Now when aiming for a high level of realism, the amount of layers and how we add those layers, it is really important. If the layers are too blocked in, then the layers underneath, those darker foundations, will get covered up and the painting ends up too light. That fur massively then loses the depth. So it's really crucial that when working slightly smaller, that we are paying attention to how many of those brushstrokes we're adding. Now another aspect here with the brush technique is that I don't want to necessarily capture every single hair. I don't have space for that on this size. But I do want to make sure that I've captured about that right impression. So when I look at the final painting, I'm thinking, okay, I've got a nice amount of detail, but it's not to the point where it's too much and that fur now looks wiry. In some situations, more detail doesn't necessarily mean more realistic. Now, as I've been building up my lighter values, you can see that the fur does lose its colour saturation, because I'm not ever focusing on mixing the exact colour at each of my layers. I'm focusing more on the values, building up that fur gradually before I aim for my lightest highlights at the end. However, at this stage now, I'm working with glazes to adjust the colour. Now the number of glazes that I use will vary and it's no set rule. I don't mind when I'm using a glaze as long as I make sure the layers underneath are completely dry. But at this stage of my painting, I feel I've got a nice balance of my lighter midtones and I've captured enough of my shadows. So once that painting for this area has completely dried, I've then come back in now with my glaze to establish more of the colour saturation. Now again, glazes is something that I do cover thoroughly in all of my real-time step-by-step lessons, but I do have a video here on YouTube where I'm speaking all about how to use glazes and I demonstrate different paintings on the various effects they create. So if that video is of interest, I'll link that in the description below as well. Now when I'm establishing my colour, at this stage, because I'm still working more with my mid-tones, I'm not worrying about the exact colour that I see for the top layers. This is more of that centre stage of that fur. So as I'm adjusting my colour, this is not how the end colour is going to be in that finished painting. The way that we're working with glazes here, we can establish all of this gradually, just like those values. Another key part of capturing a high level of realism, alongside the layers and the glazes, is the brush technique. Now there are three main things that I like to focus on: the fur length, the fur thickness, and the fur direction. The fur direction changes very quickly in areas here, and again that is all due to that fur being longer. But the fur direction is never random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So how it curves away from the nose and then drapes over the side of the mouth. This is helping to establish more of the jaw and the skull shape. The way that the fur above the eye curves over more gradually, but how it starts and stops is helping to determine the eye socket. So everything here with how I'm moving my brushes, there does need to be consideration to make sure that variation is in place. Now the length of the brush strokes, this is going to help determine how that fur is structured in the way that it is shorter around the bridge of the nose, longer over the ears and the top of the head. When working with various breeds, this is something to pay very close attention to. A Labrador, for example, is not going to have as much variation in the fur length as this dog, but there is still changes. The fur generally around the nose is much shorter than that on the top of the head. So everything here with the brush technique, it does need to be considered. And lastly, the thickness of the brushstroke is determined by a few factors. What brush we're using, how much pressure we're applying, the consistency of the paint, even how we're moving that brush and holding the brush. But what I want to be focusing on here, just like with all of the other aspects, is that there is that variety. The fur is not the same thickness from one layer to the next. This really is going to help enhance that level of realism and take the artwork to the next level. Once I was happy with the face and I knew that was about 99% complete, I have the final details left to add, but I always do those at the end. I can then start to consider the chest and the body. Now the fur here was more out of focus, the fur is more grouped together and it is curving in different directions, more so than on the face. Now because the fur is shorter than that on the edges of the face, the movement and the way that it curves was a little bit more exaggerated. It didn't have as much of that longer free-flowing fur that's seen elsewhere. So I really wanted to capture more of the curve in my brushstroke. So this is where I'm shortening my brushstrokes. They're still longer than something of a Labrador, but they are much shorter than what I've been working with so far. Now capturing this variation at this stage is also going to help make this fur here have more of that natural appearance. The way that I've altered my brushstrokes, it really will help with that end result of the painting. Although there are variations in how I'm adjusting the movement of my brush, the length of my brushstrokes, the process is the same in that I'm building up my layers gradually. The way that the fur separates here on the left and right side is going to help determine the placement of the legs. So the fur direction, it's very similar to the importance of the highlights and shadows and how they are positioned. The placement of a highlight and shadow, it's not random, it does follow that underlying bone and muscular structure. So as I'm starting to establish more of these highlights and the way that they're curving, this is helping with that shoulder placement and that front leg. If this movement and the curve here was a little bit too far over to the right, then I've actually pushed that leg and the shoulder too far to the centre of the body. So how this fur is curving and that highlight and shadow placement is really, really crucial, and why I like to establish this more at my earlier stages. As I'm starting to build in more refinement here, the softness is only really being established because I've captured that right from the very beginning. I'm still working with my softening techniques, but it's that base layer that was soft initially that's helping to reinforce the softness of the details. I've got lots of videos here on YouTube that show many different textures and fur colours, and this is something that is a consistent similarity throughout. Regardless of the variations, very drastic different reference photos, the base layer that I like to work with, it still has those same rules of softness. One of the final things I would just like to mention here is a check that we can do that's invaluable to the painting process at the end, and that is to use a larger brush with a little bit of water and apply a thin layer of that over the area of the painting that's dry. When that painting is dry, the colours of that acrylic paint can look like they've faded, they've got a little bit muted and dull. It's not that that colour has faded as such. If you're using light fast materials, that isn't anything to worry about. But what the painting does do in certain brands that are used is that the painting dries with a matte finish. So once a gloss varnish is applied, that colour saturation goes back to being nice and vibrant, the shadows look darker, your highlights look brighter, and everything just has much more of a wow impact about it. By using this method of applying water first, we can then think, well, actually that colour saturation needs to be better. We need to make that highlight a little bit brighter. We can then make those changes before adding a final varnish over the top. This is just something that really can make a big difference. So I really hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in painting along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.